Thank you very much for asking me to speak about India, in which country I spent many happy hours. India is vast. There are over 200 languages and many dialects. Literacy is only about 15 or 20%, except in the south, where the Portuguese came and settled. And where they built a church, they built a school, and so education was encouraged. I think it is important to understand the caste system. There are 4 castes. Brahmins are the highest, from which come their priests. Then there are warriors. Then merchants and businessmen, and finally servants. Those are the 4 castes. But apart from that, there are outcasts. You mustn't think that they are poor people. It is just an accident of birth, and it is thought that it originated from mixed marriages many years before. They are not allowed to go to the village well, or to go into the temple, or even to use the burning ghat for the cremation of their dead. They must have their own. I remember hearing about a Hindu woman who was converted to Christianity, and she said, even although she was a Christian, she found it very difficult to accept outcasts. And certainly a Brahmin would never invite an outcast into his house. Well, the village I went to was called Panvel. It has quite a big compound. We had our hospital buildings and our living quarters. There was a separate building for the kitchen, which is quite common in India. And we had 2 large buildings at the bottom of the compound, which we usually let out. And we had our little chapel, to which our chaplain came in the beginning every week from Bombay, and then he was transferred to Poona and could only come every fortnight, and then finally we had a local Indian chaplain. The whole place had been closed for 2 years because they hadn't got a matron to run it, and then I went there. Our main work was midwifery, although we had medical cases in the hospital as well. There was an outpatient department to which all kinds of people came, men, women and children, and we often had to go out to villages because people were too frightened to come into hospital. They thought they would die, and often we had to go by the very slow method of transport, bullock cart. There are various communities in India. I have mentioned Hindus, there are Muslims, and in our village there was quite a big community of people called Beni Israelites. These are people who came originally from Baghdad and settled down the west coast and intermarried with Hindus, and they are not allowed to go into the ordinary Jewish synagogue. They must have their own. When we had patients in the hospital who were Beni Israelite and they had a baby son, they had to go home on the 7th day for the circumcision on the 8th. I have often been invited to circumcision services, ceremony it is really, and the first time I went, I noticed what looked to me like a huge cupboard at the back, and I asked what it was, and I was told it was the Ark. And it was opened, and I was shown that inside there were many scrolls, all the books of the law, fastened by a rod, a silver rod, and on the top there was a vessel which looked like, to me, like a chalice used in churches for communion. Well, at the circumcision, the most important male member of the family sat on a chair with a cushion on his knees, and on this was placed the baby, and the baby was secured to the cushion by bandages round its legs and hands. And the rabbi came from Bombay, and he performed the ceremony using a knife. In hospital we use scissors. And he had a little table on which there was some Dettol, I noticed, and cotton wool, and also what looked like dandelion fluff, but I was told it was a hemostat to stop the bleeding. Well, he performed the ceremony very neatly and expertly, and afterwards he always used to go to check up that the baby had been able to pass urine. I was very surprised to notice how good the baby was, and I said to someone afterwards, "Do you give the baby anything before the ceremony?" And they said, "Oh yes, we give him brandy." And this, mark you, was in a country where there was prohibition, but perhaps they were allowed to have a permit for brandy on occasions like this. Many diseases we treated. There were a lot of skin diseases. Lots and lots of children and some adults had worms. And when they had worms, they became very pot-bellied and very pale and anemic. And we used to use a medicine called chenopodium oil, which was most effective, but we don't use that nowadays. There are other more sophisticated medicines, because there had been fatal cases when an overdose had been given inadvertently. People came with all kinds of fevers. They had malaria, sometimes there was typhoid, and other diseases as well. We had, in the ward, the patients came and stayed for 10 days. When they came, they often brought a penknife to put under the pillow to keep ghosts away, they said. And when they went home, they left a coconut in the baby's cot, because it was unlucky to leave it empty, they said. The patient had her bed in the ward, and at the end of the bed there was an attachment from which was suspended the baby's cot, and a piece of cord was tied to the baby's cot so the mother could rock it with remote control. They usually stayed for 10 days, although of course in accordance with modern ideas we had them up after 24 hours. But very often they had to be very hard working at home, and so the 10 days at least gave them some rest. Sometimes patients came already in labour. They came from a distance. They'd never been to an antenatal examination, and indeed I remember one patient who had her baby, or started to have the baby I should say, as we quickly took out a stretcher for her, in what is called a tonga. That is like the old-fashioned pony and trap we used to have in England. There are some patients which stand out in my memory. There was one woman called Nirmala, and her husband had a little shop in the village, but he died very suddenly from a heart attack. And one day she came to me and said she thought she was pregnant because she had missed her periods. So I said, "Oh, Nirmala, you've had a very great shock. I don't expect you are." She said, "Oh, please will you examine me?" Well, I examined her, and sadly for her, I found that she was pregnant. But during her pregnancy, she contracted pleurisy. We admitted her and treated her, and then eventually she had the baby. And within about a week of the baby being born, she went to Bombay to stay with her sister. And she stayed away for about 3 months. And when she returned, I was absolutely horrified at the condition of the baby. And I said, well, Nirmala, what have you been feeding the baby with? And she said, well, you know I couldn't feed her, so we could only give the baby the water after we had boiled the rice in it. Well, we admitted the baby and treated the baby with iron and vitamins, and also we gave Glaxo, and Glaxo Company very kindly donated some of their milk for us, and the baby improved tremendously, and after a few months was sitting up and laughing and chatting. And so I said to Nirmala, you must bring this baby every week for examination. And she did for a time, and then off she went to Bombay again. And when she came back, the baby was really back in square one. And we admitted her again and gave treatment. But this time, unfortunately, we were not able to save her sight, which she lost through malnutrition. And I was able to get her into a blind home in Bombay, but they would only keep her for a year. And then I negotiated to try and get her into a Cheshire home. Another patient we had was called Canterbury, and she was a very nice woman and English speaking, as there were only very few women were. More men were perhaps English speaking, but you seldom found many women. And her husband was a bailiff, and he used to have to go round to small villages and collect money. And one day in the hot weather he had gone out, and because it was hot he was sleeping on the veranda of an office. And unfortunately for him, in the night thieves came along and stole his money and killed him. And of course Canterbury was absolutely distraught, and I very often used to go down and see her. And she said to me, ours was a love marriage. You probably know that most of the marriages in India are arranged, but Canterbury said hers was a love marriage. She was a Brahmin, but he was of a slightly lower caste. And she said he used to get up first in the morning and make her a cup of tea and bring it to her. And that was absolutely unheard of for an Indian to do for his wife. And so I used to talk to her a lot, and I remember saying to her, you know, Nirmala, in our religion we believe in another life with God, and we think that we shall see those people whom we have loved again. Well, Hindus, you see, believe in reincarnation, which means they may come back into this world in the person of someone else. And Canterbury used to ask me over and over again to tell her that. And I think it comforted her that although she was a Hindu, perhaps she too thought that she would see her husband again. And we had a gardener called Marley. That is the name for gardener in Marathi. And his wife was called Malinbai. He was a very nice old man, but eventually he got ill, and I took him to Bombay for an X-ray. His voice became very hoarse and feeble, and I wondered if he had some cancer of the throat. However, I used to go and see him when he was ill and take him pictures to look at, pleasant pictures. And then one day he died. And after he had died, his wife, at the time, the beginning of the funeral procession, which was to the burning ghat, he is clothed in white with a white cloth over him, and because white is the colour of mourning in India, and the head is not covered. I remember the first time I saw a funeral in Bombay, I was really horrified. Flowers are put on the white cloth, but before the journey starts off, his wife, Marlinbai, had to break what is called a Mangalsutra. Indian women don't wear a wedding ring. Instead they wear a chain of small black beads around their neck, and just hanging down a little gold ornament. And wealthy people, of course, have much more gold in their chain, the Mangalsutra. Marlenbai had to break this Mangalsutra over the body of her husband, and also break the bangles she was wearing. Women, however poor they are, all wear bangles, even if they're only made of glass. And I thought that was a very sad thing to witness. Well, I used to go to Bombay every month, and I got to know, through friends, I met a man who had originally a library of 5,000 books, but he was the vice principal of the cathedral school in Bombay, and when he retired from there, he had a smaller flat, and he reduced his library to 3,000. Well, he was very kind to me, and I used to borrow 4 or 5. I only went to Bombay once a month. I didn't have a day off a week, and so we had 4 days at a time. And he always would lend me several books to take back and read. Well, one day he said to me, "This is a book which would interest you." And it was a book on hypnosis. It was about a man who'd been in the RAF in the last war. He was shot down, he was in hospital, and while there he decided that he would do medicine. Well, he came out, he studied medicine and qualified, and married a nurse and had a practice in Clapham in London. Then after a time he wanted to specialise, but I read that he didn't have a surgeon's hands. I thought perhaps they might have been burnt or something when he was shot down in the war. And so he decided he would do hypnosis. And the book is written by a friend of his, and each chapter represents a lecture he attended. Well, I read this book and I was absolutely fascinated by it. And I had a doctor friend in Bombay who was honorary doctor at a big school, and he lent me books about hypnosis. I read all the history. I sent to England for another book. And one day he said to me, "I'm going to hypnotize a boy. Would you like to see?" So, of course, I was delighted. I said, "Oh, yes." And he had the boy on the veranda, and I went into a room just off the veranda and peeped through the curtains. This boy was 12 years old, but he was still a bedwetter. And he came from an unhappy home background. But eventually a doctor did cure him. So, as I say, I remained very interested in hypnosis. In the village, I belonged to a small medical club. And I was asked to give a talk. Well, I had already spoken once, and I was wondering what I would talk about, when I thought, oh, I know, I'll talk about hypnosis. And so over a weekend, we had the meeting on the Monday, I was preparing what I was going to say, and then I suddenly thought, suppose somebody asks me if I have ever hypnotized anyone, and I say no, I should feel very stupid. So I started on my staff, and I did 3 on the Saturday and 3 on the Sunday. And then afterwards I was able to use hypnosis on certain patients when they were in labour, and that reduced the amount of drugs we had to give them. There's one more little story, interesting perhaps. My ward sister had a son, and he and his family, his wife and 4 children, lived in one of our buildings at the bottom of the compound. And sister came to me at 11 o'clock one night and said that he was possessed by a spirit. Well, spirit possession is very common in India, and in August there was always a ceremony where, when young men said to be possessed had to run across the road from one side to the other, and when they reached one side there was a man who whipped them. with a thonged whip, and I have been very, very close to him, and I have seen that they actually were whipped. Then after this had happened for several times, they sort of fell into the arms of a waiting friend and were given a glass of water and were then recovered. So I said to Sister, "Oh, don't be silly, Sister." I said, "We're Christian." She said, "Oh, yes, he is possessed, he is." So I went down, and they had a very large room, and the boy, Prabhakar, was lying on his stomach and wriggling down the room very, very quickly, because I thought if I was doing that, lying on my tummy and having to wriggle down the room, I think I would do it in jerks. I couldn't do it quickly. And when he got to the door, he banged his feet against it. Then he would get up and bang his head against the wall, and one time he picked up a musical instrument to throw at his wife. And so I thought, oh dear, I must do something. And I thought I would give a drug called paraldehyde. This, again, is not used much nowadays, but it is a very safe drug.